So I'll just talk a little bit about FAI Farms, just to start with really briefly, is we help food brands improve their supply chains, whether that be animal welfare, sustainability, or in this new world, in regeneration. And the way in which we do that is through through a number of different ways. One is strategic business advice. We've got data systems, and we've got a team of experts. We've got people that are farmers, vets, supply chain experts, and the kind of collaboration of all that information together from kind of real people from the supply chain helps food businesses transition. And many people wonder what is regenerative agriculture? I don't know if everyone's familiar with it. We have this conversation endlessly about what it is, and the way in which we describe it is a what is it? It's a system that mimics nature, a farming system that mimics nature. And we often think that we're already doing that when we're in amongst nature on a farm, but actually in the way we're often trying to control nature. We're often trying to control weeds. We're often trying to like get rid of things because we want to get rid of some things and not others, and keep the plants that we want. And so what we're aiming to do with regenerative agriculture is take the power of nature and harness that and mimic what she does. So for example, if I see thistles in my livestock field, I don't think how do I get rid of those thistles? I think, that's interesting. Why have I got thistles? What's the meaning of them? And how do I adjust my management in order to kind of have the thistles there, let them do their job, and get rid of, and eventually they'll go because the soil biology will change. So thistles, for example, have a really deep tap root compared to grasses, which tend to be like this in the way we currently manage them anyway. And so actually when you've got a lot of thistles, you've probably got compaction. So it's actually Mother Nature's way of saying we've got compaction. So now when I see thistles in the field, we think, okay, we need to manage that area for compaction rather than how do I kill the thistles as quickly as possible. And one thing I should have said about FAI actually is that we are at the center of everything we do. So we do all the big corporate stuff and we work with all the brands, but actually we have a farm, a 1,200 acre farm, and just outside Oxford. It's a mixed livestock and arable farm, and that is the farm whereby I guess I gained my experience and understanding about what regenerative systems were, in that, as you said, we transitioned from organic to organic regenerative. And I thought that when we first set out that, well, we're already organic, we must be doing the best, that doesn't get better than this when it comes to biodiversity and soil, etc. But I learned a lot. And often in our organic systems, we are just kind of mimicking conventional methodologies, but without the chemicals. And so that's something that I've kind of really learned. But also just to say that we've got the farm there at the center of what we do. So I'm just going through my slides, and I'm going to wait for some of the pictures to come. But why, I guess, just the background as to why we are doing what we're doing, to remind ourselves, although we don't really need a reminder here, but just that if we look at Johan Rockstrom's work and the planetary boundaries, we spend most of our time at the moment talking about climate change as being our biggest worry and our biggest threat, whereas actually we've already way surpassed the planetary boundary for biodiversity loss and also for nitrogen cycling. And as farmers, we are kind of one of the kind of key industry groups, I guess, that can have some control and influence over the amount of biodiversity we have in our landscape and the way that nitrogen is used, or preferably not used in artificial forms anymore. And so it's just recognizing that 50% of the usable land in the world is used for food production, and therefore farmers have great opportunity. But we often hear in the food industry that, oh yeah, we've got the answers, we've got the land, whereas without the recognition that change needs to happen. And so that's what I work on, I guess, is that helping recognize what change is needed. Now, are you? Yes, you're on my slides. Amazing. So that's the farm. Fast forward to the next slide, please. Planetary boundaries. We can see, and just that quote from Johan, what we do between 2020 and 30 will be the decisive decade for humanity's future on Earth, which often when I put that up for farmers, they're a bit like, ooh, that's a bit much. But I think sometimes it's important that we all recognise the role that we have to play. Next slide, please. So this is that's the big kind of Johann's work is the big global why it's important. And this is the why it's important on our farm and increasingly on farms, you know, across the world, but even in the UK, we're facing climate extremes. To start with, it was just, oh, it's a bad year, it's a wet year, it's a dry year. Now every winter is the wettest winter on record, and every summer tends to be the driest, or every spring. And we're seeing this move away from the predictable climates that we thought we'd see. And of course, when you've got this happening on your farm, then that is much more difficult to deal with and affects the way that we plan. I love the title of this conference being about planning, because one thing that I think that we don't necessarily do in farming enough is plan well, or design. We don't use design. We just kind of do what we like, if we like cattle farming or dairy farming, or we do what our family did. We're not necessarily looking at the landscape and the ecosystem and thinking, how do I best mimic nature in this area in order to make the best from it? So that's just a really for me, it was really interesting that the title of the conference was about planning. But if we go to the next slide, so this was one of my defining moments. That you can see that wet picture previously was pretty common on our farm now. 50% of our farm, so 600 acres, goes under every winter now, and it used to be like 1 in 10 winters. Now it is every winter for multiple belts of time. It might dry up for a bit, but the rain comes back and then we go under again. And then it was a couple of years ago at lambing, which is in April, and we'd had the wettest winter on record, and the farm had looked like the previous slide. And then at lambing in April, it looked like this, and all the cracks were on the ground already. And I was like, where has all the water gone? So that's when I realized that we needed to do something different about the way in which we managed our land. Next slide, please. Oh, so I've skipped around a bit, but just regenerative agriculture, a system of farming principles and practices that increase biodiversity, enrich soil, improve watersheds, and enhance ecosystem services. I think I've said a bit about that, so we move on to the next one. So how do we do it? What are we doing differently? Majority of, we changed our grazing management. I mean, we did lots of other learning about holistic thinking and everything else, but in the main, practically on the ground, what do we do differently? We graze differently. So we used to set stock graze, where the animals were turned out and would be in fields for weeks at a time. We did actually go through a transition then to rotational grazing, and where we were moving animals around more quickly. They were in. We split the field using electric fences into smaller cells, and they were in those fields for only a day or two, but we would cycle them back around quite quickly. So we were trying to maximize the utilization of the grass that we got. And we grew a lot more grass. Like, it was a really good system, productivity wise, less inputs. And we see that consistently across farms that implement this, even when they're not organic. They're using less fertilizer and less bought in feed, and can increase their stocking rate. So that is a great sustainable, a better, more sustainable grazing system, because you can get more from less without the usual sustainable intensification model that you need to get more from less. But what we've done is taken that a step further and moved to regenerative or adaptive multi-paddock grazing, or holistic plan grazing, for those that are familiar with the Savory Institute. And adaptive multi-paddock grazing is effectively a large group of animals in a small area of land for a short period of time, followed by a long rest period. And the idea is that we mimic the behavior of buffalo and bison when they roamed, where they wouldn't come back and keep regrazing the same land. They would move on to somewhere else in search of water or more food. And that land would get an intensive graze, trampling organic matter back into the soil, feeding the soil microbes with urine and dung, and then leaving it for a really long time to let it really rest and recover, because we know that what's above the ground in grass length is below the ground in root length. So when we're constantly grazing grass like this, like we mow our lawns, we only ever have short roots, and we need deeper roots for better water infiltration, better mining of minerals, etc., is better overall soil health. Next slide, please. I'm conscious I'm running out of time. So I was just going to say on this picture is that, so this is a better example of a mob. they're standing all together. We don't keep them that tight. They've got about 10 times that space to roam in, but they're all stood together on that day, probably because we're about to move them into the next cell. My key reason for showing this slide is that often when we're talking to farmers, they don't like it because it looks messy. And this is one of the mindset shift elements that we need to get our head around when we're thinking about systems that mimic nature. Nature doesn't do neat, it doesn't do straight lines. Nature does messy because it's about lots of interactions. So I show this slide quite often just to show this long grass, and most farmers have a heart attack over it. But we graze that and we leave about 50% of that material behind because it acts as solar panels to grow more grass, and it keeps the ground covered to prevent evaporation. Next slide, please. And then this is just another one to talk about what we mean by, I guess, sustainable and regenerative. And we kind of look at it as this sliding scale because I don't think there is any end destination. We don't really know what it means to be, when you get the tick to say that you are fully regenerative, or that you can do no more. I don't know if we'll ever get there. I know that what we know, there are lots of signs that we can look for the land to be regenerating, and we kind of we're just trying to encourage everybody to move up this scale. What's quite interesting is that when you put this up sometimes and ask people to pitch where they think they are now, in the main, even in organic farming, we are in this sort of lower conventional nature friendly block there. There's very few farms that have actually achieved net zero, and in the main we're in this kind of making space for nature paradigm where we say we're going to do farming here and nature over here, whereas in regenerative agriculture we're saying, well, why don't we just do nature everywhere but also do productivity everywhere, because actually nature is very productive if you kind of work with it rather than against it. So in the main, what we're doing when we're talking about transitioning people to being regenerative, it's just slowly making small steps or some large steps up the scale to a system that is summarized as putting back more than it takes out, because in the main, most of our systems at the moment are still extractive in their nature. Not intentionally, not that farmers get up in the morning to think, today I'm going to mine my soil, but just the system that we've been kind of told is best practice, and the focus on yield and everything else has led us to end up in that position. Next slide, please. So coming back to my point about planning, I love this. I love that question. What are we planning for? And I think maybe what we need to move from is planning for yield, and we need to move to planning for health. I heard talks earlier about flavour and taste, and we lay that up as well with nutrient density. There's increasing research to show that most of our food now doesn't have the nutrient level in it that it used to, because of intensive agriculture has kind of stripped out the soil health, and therefore that has reduced the nutrient density of our food. And if we as farmers just, and the whole food supply chain just targeted ourselves on health per hectare or nutrient density per hectare, how that would change the face of our farming system, because our monocultures would go away and we would end up with layered stack systems. So imagine the top field without the sprayer, but with trees and growing fruit and shrubs and possibly nuts, but also timber and browse for animals. And you could have cattle, sheep, poultry, all of those things stacked in that space. So we often think about yield at the moment is about like how many of one thing can we get from that field. Actually, we'd be like, how many layers of things can we get? And when we do that, we have great interactions with within the soil. We don't tend to need the disease control chemicals, and therefore the overall quality of the product goes up. And Vandana Shiva, sort of my semi-hero at the moment, follow her work really closely. I love everything she does, but she's the one I just wanted to give her credit here for coining the health per acre rather than yield per acre. And I just think it's something that would be transformational if the food system took up that as a measure. Next slide, please. And I think it's my last one, so we're nearly there. But what are we currently planning for? Most companies that I work with are planning for carbon. And the one thing that I always put up is this slide to just say we just need to make sure that we focus on everything else that's happening and not just carbon. Now, carbon is a really good lens into everything else. Better soil, healthier soil tends to have more carbon in it. So that's a good thing. But also that if we just focus on carbon and carbon targets, then we kind of forget everything else that's happening. Good example would be in livestock production. It would look at them, if you did a pure carbon footprint, it would look like intensive chicken is better than cattle, for example, but actually cattle is part of an ecosystem interacting with that landscape like we're doing on our farm, and that you're getting lots of ecosystem services coming from that, then you're not getting that when you've got a chicken in a shed eating soya and grain from everywhere else. They might look very efficient and it might be very good from a carbon emissions point of view, but it doesn't sell the whole picture. And in fact, the report from the Sustainable Food Trust that came out this week talked about actually starting, for the first time I've seen that acknowledged somewhere, that actually beef and ruminant animals at the same level, but a lesser consumption of pork and chicken in the intensive systems will be better for overall what we're seeing. And then I think one more quick slide, is that, or is that my last one? That might be my last one. Yeah. Oh no, just this one. And one key message, I guess, for me is, at the moment I spend a lot of time with people talking about system tweaks. So it's like, oh, well, if we just change that, or we just change this little thing, we need to get our heads around the fact, I think, that we need a system shift. And I love to show this slide, which just shows that one thing that we can do is to cover soil. And if we cover soil, look at the temperature difference. And therefore that leads to better productivity. Yeah. And what does regenerative business look like? Because we often talk about regenerative farming, but actually we all need to think differently. And that is about food businesses throughout the supply chain.